Edward was the boyfriend I deceived. He was deaf. I loved whispering sweet nothings in his ear when we were intimate, taking out his hearing aid. Imagine my surprise when I found out he was actually a prince from a wealthy family. So, the night we broke up, things got pretty messy. Edward told me to leave with a red face. And I did. It wasn't until 3 years later, when I heard news of his engagement, that I dared to return. Edward had a cold, emotionless expression on his face as he turned and used a belt to restrain me. "Where do you think you're escaping to this time?" "You're my fiancé." I pretended to adjust the camera, my palms already sweaty. I hadn't expected to encounter Edward so soon. Even if she looks young, in these past few years, she has won numerous international photography awards, the editor Emma teased me, trying to lighten the mood. I spent a lot of money to lure her over from abroad. "You definitely won't regret giving us the opportunity to shoot the first cover." Edward glanced at me indifferently, calmly responding, "Is that so? Well, then, thank you for your efforts." It was the most formal of polite remarks. I cleared my throat, trying to make my voice sound thicker, at least not like the me from years ago. "It's the least I can do, Edward." Edward nodded, without giving me any extra eye contact. I lowered my eyelids, trembling slightly. He didn't recognize me. Well, I had changed my last name. And with a mask covering my face, based on appearance alone, no one would connect the me in front of him with the once vibrant and flamboyant Wendy. During the photo shoot, Edward was very cooperative. With just a slight hint from me, Edward could quickly strike the most suitable poses for me. There were murmurs behind me. "Edward's physique is amazing, isn't it? This Wendy, courtesy of Emma's hefty investment, really knows how to capture the body structure and angles so well." I suddenly felt dizzy. I remembered a young man with a flushed neck, completely naked. Although I had drawn him many times, he still seemed shy to me. Of course, only up until a certain point. Every time, for some reason, I would inexplicably change locations during the painting session. From the bedroom to the couch, bathtub, and French window. Eventually, I ended up exhausted, more tired than drawing 10 nude sketches. I kicked him in frustration. "Edward, it's always like this. I'm not drawing you again. I need to find a model with an 8-pack. Edward held my ankle without saying a word. After a moment, he bent down to kiss my mouth. "Wendy, I'm sorry." I was stunned. Was this admitting to a mistake and ready to change his ways? The next moment, Edward took off his hearing aid. 4 boxes of coats, different flavors. I couldn't get out of bed for a week. He even apologized to me. What a polite gesture. But in the end, we still broke up. That night, it was as embarrassing as ever. Edward's eyes were slightly red, his voice cold. "Wendy, this is the last time. I won't look back." I hung my head, softly replied. Edward tightened his jaw, sneered. "Fine, you can leave. Don't let me see you again in this lifetime. Otherwise, I will definitely kill you." During a break in the shoot, I took the opportunity to return to the equipment room to get a dropped portrait lens. Shadows fell behind me. The familiar woody scent lingered in my nostrils. I stiffly turned around, trying to appear calm. "What's wrong, Edward?" Edward lowered his gaze to me, just like before. I held my breath, gripping my palms tightly. I couldn't afford to be flustered. "It's nothing. Just wandering around." Edward's eyes were pitch black, and he smiled faintly. "But Wendy, why are you so nervous?" I covered my trembling right hand. "The camera is heavy, and shooting for too long can make my hands shake. Is that so?" I lowered my head. "Edward, it's nothing. I'll go back to the studio to prepare." Without waiting for Edward's response, I turned and left. "Wendy." Edward called out to me, "If someone who has betrayed you reappears in front of you, what would you do?" Although Edward and I had a messy breakup, it couldn't be considered betrayal. And knowing Edward's personality, if he recognized me, he would definitely expose me immediately, not act so cold and indifferent like now. I took a deep breath, turned to the side, and smiled with a businesslike tone. "Edward, although I'm not sure about any past entanglements you might have with this person, I think people should always look forward and not dwell on insignificant details of the past. Insignificant details?" Edward teasingly remarked. "You're quite broad-minded, Wendy." Edward arched his lips. "But what if I stubbornly refuse to let go?" "Edward, this is your private matter. I'm just a photographer, I'm afraid I can't help you. Edward stared at me without saying a word. My pretense of composure felt like it was about to be uncovered any second. After a while, Edward finally spoke. Anyway, it's just photography. The entire shoot went smoothly, finishing an hour earlier than planned. After seeing Edward off, I started packing up the photography equipment. Emily ran over, pulling my arm and urged me towards the door. Wendy, you have to leave quickly. Something big happened, what's going on? I asked, but the words stuck in my throat. On the platform outside the studio, there were roses scattered everywhere with my name arranged in candles. How should I put it? It was truly tacky that I had rejected Peter 3 times already, but he was persistent. And now, in front of everyone, he was staging this embarrassing scene. No one knew how awful my face looked underneath the mask at that moment. I had allergies to pollen, so thankfully I was wearing a mask. As I turned to leave, Peter stopped me. Holding a bouquet of flowers, he pleaded, Wendy, I really, really like you. I promise to treat you well. Will you just say yes to me, please? For a moment, I felt dizzy. These were the same words I said to Edward. My feelings towards Edward were purely superficial. Among all the people I had met, only Edward had managed to captivate my heart perfectly. The bar male model, he looked unapproachable. He even wore a hearing aid, making him appear even colder and more distant. Later, I learned that the bar was owned by his family. I made every effort. Used all my tricks, pestered and manipulated him until I finally got him into bed. That night, I whispered sweet nothings to Edward. Edward, I really, really like you. I will treat you well, super duper well. Can we be together? Edward lifted his head from my neck, his intense gaze fixed on me. You really, really like me? I didn't have time to analyze the emotions churning in Edward's eyes. Yes, truly. Edward hoarsely asked, will you promise me that you will only love me for the rest of your life, and we will be together? At that time, I didn't fully understand the implications of for life as Edward mentioned. I raised my head and bit Edward's lips. Okay, I'll only love you. It was only after being together that I realized Edward's cold facade was just an act. He was greedier than anyone else. I always took off his hearing aid when we were intimate, whispering and shouting whatever I pleased, even though he couldn't hear me. I enjoyed seeing his stoic response. I had a hot temper, and Edward always catered to me, letting me have my way. I thought we could truly be together forever. Until one day, I accidentally saw a photo of Edward and his father together. On a summer afternoon, Edward's fingers gently intertwined in my hair. I felt the warmth from the hairdryer by my ear. I learned about the deep connections between Edward's family and mine. My heart sank like a rock. The cheers brought me back to reality. Before I knew it, Peter was already kneeling on one knee, and the crowd was urging me to say yes. I took a deep breath, trying to control my temper. Peter, My wrist was suddenly gripped tightly, sharp fingers pinching me. I looked up, our eyes locking. The sable eyes resembled a vast web ready to devour me whole. Edward's voice was cold. Wendy, come home. Why? Afraid I might poison you? A whole table of food with chili even in the soup. I love spicy food, while Edward always had a plain diet. I was taken aback, unable to decipher Edward's actions at that moment. And to discover that he had bought the apartment where we had once lived together. I stood up. Thank you, Edward, for helping me out today. It's getting late, so I should take my leave. Edward raised an eyebrow, mocking. Edward? Wendy, you're really good at drawing boundaries, aren't you? Since you're back, why not catch up? I looked down. There's nothing between us to catch up on. Nothing? Edward tightened his jaw, mocking. Right, after all, even if I were to die in front of you, you wouldn't bat an eye. Edward stared at me, his face still as cold as ever, though veins were visible on his neck. I looked at Edward and softly said, Edward, we're all adults. Why cling to the past? The past? Am I just a piece of the past to you? Edward interrupted, his voice turning harsh. Wendy, you never loved me, did you? If you didn't love me, then why did you come back to provoke me again? Edward grabbed my wrist, his eyes dark and sinister. Wendy, I told you. If I see you again, I will definitely kill you. I know you wouldn't, Edward. I looked up. I understand you. Understand me? What do you understand? Edward sneered. Am I obedient enough? Pure enough? Do I listen to you enough, or am I generous enough? Wendy, it's all an act. It was just pretense before to please you. Ruthlessness, selfishness, and getting even are who I really am. I took a deep breath and said in a low voice, Edward, I apologize for appearing abruptly and disturbing you. I'll go to the company tomorrow to resign. I promise you won't see me again. Wendy. Edward's face darkened, gritting his teeth, and I really wanted to open him up to see if he had a heart. The grip on my wrist tightened gradually. The distance closed, breath mingled. Desire surged in Edward's eyes. I struggled hard. Edward, let me go. Everything felt like a bowstring about to be released. The next moment, Edward's pupils suddenly contracted, abruptly pushed me away, emotions churning in his eyes. After a while, Edward smirked and said ambiguously, All right, Wendy. He slammed the door behind him, leaving me locked in the apartment. Only then did I realize that my phone seemed to have fallen in Edward's car. As the clock struck 3, Edward had not returned. The closet was filled with rows of brand new ladies' nightwear, delicate and revealing. It's not my style, it's Edward's fiancée's. Edward was getting engaged. With his numerous properties, why did he have to bring her here to stay? A sour taste filled my chest. I slammed the closet shut and went to the bathroom to freshen up. Only when washing my face did I discover several red marks from my neck to collarbone. I belatedly recalled the bouquet Peter gave me. It not only embarrassed me, but also caused an allergic reaction. Suddenly, the bedroom door was pushed open from outside. Edward floated in, approaching me. The scent of alcohol filled the air. I wrinkled my nose. Why have you been drinking so much? Edward hoarsely replied, Break up with him. I can pretend that everything between you two never existed. Confused, I asked, What do you mean? Edward, with a slight tinge of red in his eyes, chuckled lightly. Why? Can't bear to let go? I dried my hands and said, Edward, you've been drinking too much. Edward stared at me. The next moment, he suddenly pulled me towards him, tilted his head, and kissed and bit my neck. The slight pain was accompanied by a tingling sensation. Edward bit down fiercely. Wendy, why can't I provoke you to the end? Why is there someone else? I instantly realized and hurriedly explained, Edward, I didn't sleep with anyone else. I pushed Edward away, creating distance. Look carefully, it's different from strawberries, it's an allergy. Pollen allergy. Edward's cold fingertips brushed against my neck, inch by inch. After a while, Edward spoke, And what about me? Do you want me? I was stunned, not yet reacting. The next moment, Edward took off his belt and tied my wrists. The room spun as my back met the cold bathtub. I struggled to sit up. Edward, you're getting engaged. Edward turned on the tap, warm water flowing over my thighs. He asked, Right, so, will you consider my proposal? Edward gazed at me, emphasizing, Will you marry me, Wendy? My fiancé. I was shocked. Are these engagement rumors you spread false? Why else would you come back? Edward took off his hearing aid and placed it on the shelf. Wendy, I told you. Long legs straddled the bathtub, kneeling beside my waist, leaning in, seeing you again. It's fate. With Edward's abilities, he could truly make good on his word. Panicked, I quickly raised my hand to stop his proximity. Edward, let's talk somewhere else, can we? Before I could react, I suddenly realized, Edward. Can't hear. The lights went out. The darkness, coupled with the warm mist, heightened all senses. Edward chuckled softly. I never said I couldn't hear. It was just unclear sometimes when I took off the hearing aid, but you made those bold advances every time. In the darkness, his seductive tone continued, I really like it. Did I hear all those salacious words clearly before? My face flushed instantly. I wanted to escape, but couldn't. I choked, red-eyed, and called out to him pitifully, Edward, my wrists hurt. Please, let me go? Edward paused, loosening his grip on my wrist involuntarily. I seized the opportunity and kicked towards Edward. However, he intercepted the move. Edward's fingertips lightly brushed against my soles. Baby, kicking randomly isn't good. This time, I won't let you escape. Having breakfast. I was stunned. Was this considered breakfast? Did he want me to feed him? I quickly shook my head, picked up a sandwich, and began eating. Silence lingered between Edward and me. After a while, Edward asked, "When do you have time?" I was perplexed. "What do you mean?" Edward calmly pulled out a tissue, wiped his hands, and replied, "Registering for marriage. You can choose the wedding dress first, next week." Choked on my food, I asked in surprise, "Wait, registering? Marriage?" Edward glanced at me, "Regretting it already?" I exploded, "Regretting what? I never agreed to this. Where did this regret come from?" Edward said nothing, pulled out his phone, pressed play. Within seconds, I blushed crimson from what I heard. I jumped up and lunged for Edward's phone but tripped over, nearly falling. Luckily, Edward was quick to catch me. Stuttering, I tried to explain, these words can't be taken seriously. Those things said at that moment can't be real. Is that so? Edward caressed my wrist, lifted my chin, "But you also said you loved me." I believed it. Bewildered, I murmured, "Edward, The door was slammed open, interrupting me. A familiar voice queried, "Why are there women's shoes here?" Edward, "What the hell?" "Wendy?" Mike stared at me. "Wait, this seems off." "Edward, are you substituting a woman for love sickness?" Mike, Edward's good friend. I had seen him before. Embarrassed, I said, "No, I'm Wendy." I didn't expect that. Upon hearing that, Mike exploded, "Wendy, what are you doing back here? To torment Edward again?" Edward calmly said, "Mike." Mike exploded, "You've had your fun, almost killed Edward with your games. He's just started behaving like a human, and you, buddy, I'll change the door lock code." Edward interrupted him, then turned to me, "She'll just occasionally visit, sleep in the guest room." Mike widened his eyes in disbelief. "Edward, are you kicking me out for her?" Edward's expression remained neutral. "Otherwise? Should I kick her out in favor of you?" Mike raged, "Edward, brotherhood is like hands and feet, women are like clothes." "Oh, so you envy that I have clothes and want me to strip naked?" Edward had picked up these retorts. Mike growled, "Edward. Friendship over." Edward walked over, placing his hand on Mike's shoulder. "I knew you wouldn't bear to lose your brother." Edward said blandly, "Friendship ended, no goodbyes." Shutting the door, Edward looked at me, "Eat, don't mind him." Mike pounded on the door, yelling, then tiredly exclaimed, "Edward, you deserve all the suffering. If I get involved with you again, I'll be a fool." Silently, I sipped my congee. There was also the medicine bottle I accidentally knocked over in the morning. After a pause, I hesitated and finally asked, "Edward, have you been having a hard time these years?" Edward froze, holding the spoon tightly between his fingers. "If I say I'm not good enough, will you mind?" His fingertips pressed hard into his palm, leaving behind traces of blood. I didn't know how to respond. After a long silence, Edward said, "Since you won't mind, why bother asking?" I ran away. I was afraid that if I stayed with Edward for another 2 days, I would surrender without hesitation. I took on a job deep in the mountains that would last for a whole month. In winter, the night fell early. It was barely past 7 o'clock, but the mountains were already pitch black. I shouldn't have been there alone, but my assistant had been called away by the villagers to help and hadn't returned yet. I held a flashlight, feeling my way down the mountain. Footsteps rustled behind me. A chill ran down my spine. I gripped the flashlight tightly and hurried downhill. The next moment, the man from the house where I was staying grabbed the belt of my coat from behind. I screamed in fear, turning around quickly to shine the flashlight on the man's face. It was the homeowner. He spoke with a heavy accent. "I've been waiting for you for a long time. Finally, I found an opportunity." I raised the camera and fiercely swung it towards his head. The man winced in pain, spat on the ground, and cursed, "Not bad, I'll see how tough you are in a bit." The man tackled me to the ground. His heavy body pinned me down, and I couldn't move. I regretted coming up the mountain. I regretted not telling Edward that I actually liked him. Yuri asking for trouble. The man was lifted up by the collar and slammed against a tree. Startled birds flew away. Edward's face suddenly appeared before me, caught off guard that his fists were stained with blood. The man on the ground whimpered in pain, but Edward remained indifferent. Punch after punch landed on the man's body. His expression was grim, veins bulging on his neck. He looked less like a human, more like a wild beast just unleashed from captivity. His eyes empty, his violence fierce, the man on the ground gradually stopped struggling. It dawned on me that if Edward continued, someone would be seriously hurt. "Edward," I gasped, pulling on his arm. Edward shoved me away. Before I could even feel the pain, I knew that if he landed another blow, there would be fatal consequences. "Edward," I pleaded, grabbing his waist from behind. "Stop, Edward." The fist paused mid-air. Edward turned around in a daze. The hostility still roiling in his eyes, his chest heaving. I, wide-eyed and scared, scooted back. Only then did Edward seem to come to his senses, embracing me and patting my back gently. "Wendy, don't be afraid. I'm here." I wiped the wounds on Edward's knuckles. "Why did you come here?" "How did I come here?" Edward ground his teeth. "Wendy, I have to ask you, why do you keep running away like this? Why come to a place like this? Are you out of your mind? Do you know how dangerous it is? Going up the mountain alone. Do you think you're Wonder Woman, able to take on 10 people?" Edward was fierce, trying to intimidate me. "I will," Edward furrowed his brow. "You will what?" "If you're not well, I will feel sorry for you," I choked on the words. Edward was taken aback, then after a moment of struggle, he said, "Wendy, what do you mean?" I looked up, meeting his gaze. "Edward, let's give it another try. But discreetly, without marriage, without meeting the parents, can we do that?" "Discreetly, without marriage, without meeting the parents?" Edward looked at me, scoffing. "What? Do you want me to be your hidden lover behind closed doors?" "Wendy, why would I agree to that?" I put down the cotton swab, considering my words, feeling the absurdity of the situation. "Well, let's just forget I said anything then." Edward's composure slipped. "Wendy, what do you mean by that?" "I mean, if one day you find out I lied to you, will you forgive me? Will you break up with me?" Edward pondered seriously. "As long as it's not you being unfaithful, we can work it out." "Really, we can work it out?" I had not expected Edward to pick today to bring that up. He was now a major shareholder in the magazine company. Mark had just handed me a drink when Edward appeared at the studio entrance. I dared not accept. "No, thanks, I'm on a diet." Mark insisted I photograph him. His cover sales were always good, and I couldn't refuse. So when I left the house today, I lied, saying I was shooting a female model. Mark waved his hand. "Wendy, what's wrong?" "I couldn't hear you clearly. It's too noisy." Mark smiled. "I was asking if Wendy has a boyfriend." "Oh, she does." Mark seemed skeptical, but I asked around, and no one seems to have seen him. Mark was an outsider to the circle, rather shy. "Wendy," I interrupted Mark, checking my watch. "Sorry, I need to go get some equipment from the gear room." "You get ready, we'll start shooting in 20 minutes." As I passed by the corner of the fire escape, a large hand suddenly pulled me in. Edward pressed me against the wall from behind. Finally out, I steadied myself. "Edward, I need to apologize for something." "What do you need to apologize for?" "Is it about Mark liking you?" I hesitated. "I'm not interested in him." "Wendy, you really make me feel insecure." Edward raised his hand to stroke the delicate skin on my neck, his voice low and hoarse. "Can we go public? Can we be open about us?" We agreed. Edward. "Wendy, what are you so afraid of?" Edward suddenly leaned down and kissed me, my breath quickening. I tried to push him away, but he held me firmly. After a while, Edward released me. I caught my breath, glaring at him. "Don't suddenly kiss me during work hours next time. Got it?" Edward smiled without answering. Glancing at the time, I hurried to the gear room, completely unaware of Edward's challenging gaze towards the door and the spilled juice by the wall. I got back together with Edward. "Mom." I pushed my mom in a wheelchair around the hospital garden. My mom spoke softly. "Did you tell him that you're my daughter?" I dared not. My mom didn't ask again. I pushed her around in circles. My dad passed away early. My mom raised me alone. For many years, she had been alone. It wasn't until college that an uncle suddenly appeared in the family. He was handsome and had a charismatic aura. I knew he had status and background. I was happy that my mom had found someone to spend her life with. Until I met Edward and saw a photo of him with his father on his phone. Turns out, the man my mom referred to as her boyfriend already had a wife and children. My perfect mom, intruding into someone else's family. Edward's father had an affair, and Edward's mother threatened with her life. In the end, she broke her leg and was bound to a wheelchair for life. I was afraid that Edward would be disgusted with me once he knew the truth, so I hastily broke up with him. But in our reunion, greed and avoidance took over, and I was too afraid to reveal the truth. I held the fire in my hands. Every day, I walked on thin ice in my clear confusion. But dreams will eventually fade. Photos were thrown at me, hitting the table loudly. Edward's mother, with her normally well-maintained face, suddenly turned fierce. "Wendy, if you want to be with Edward, it'll have to be over my dead body." She angrily threatened and intimidated me. I stood there silently, bending over. It was only when she said, "Wendy, don't mess with me, or I'll make sure you end up worse than your mother," that I asked, "What do you mean?" She leaned in close to my ear, pushing her wheelchair. "During that car accident, I wanted to kill her on the spot. But who knew she would survive, though her organs were damaged and her life expectancy shortened, right?" Enraged, I shoved her, and the wheelchair toppled over. Edward arrived just then. He stared at me in disbelief. In his gaze was confusion, struggle, pain, and the thing I feared the most, disgust at the fire I had tried so hard to contain finally burned through my palms. I lost contact with Edward. I went to work mechanically every day. The rest of my time, I spent at the hospital. The doctor said my mother didn't have much time left. I had recorded our conversation that day. I contemplated making Edward's mother pay for her actions. But how would that help? Both Edward and I would be left without mothers, and would that make things right? One evening, as I went back home to get some clothes, the hallway lights were out, and a figure loomed in the darkness at my door. I ignored it, fumbling for my keys in the dark, and opened the door. Edward reached out, grabbing my sleeve. "Wendy, how did it come to this?" His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. "Why are you her daughter?" I crouched down, lifting Edward's face. His unkempt stubble made him look desolate. I gently embraced him. Tears fell hot on my shoulder. After a long while, Edward said, "I can't bear to watch my mother die. Wendy, let's break up." I patted his back and said, "Okay, I promise you. Sister, here are some flowers for you." Kama rushed up to me, handing me the flowers and making funny faces with her fingers on her face. "Don't be sad. Kids in the city at the age of 12 can speak simple, fluent English. But Kama can't even pronounce words properly. Education resources are lacking here, with few schools. So, most kids, once they reach a certain age, help their families with hurting and seldom go to school. 3 months ago, my mother passed away. I quit my job, carrying her ashes, wandering around. Life seemed to have lost its meaning and purpose all of a sudden. I joked, "Why didn't you go to class?" When it was Kama's turn to frown, she said, "The teacher is sick." I took her hand and said, "Let's go check it out." Amy had a fever, and given the limited conditions, she had to rely on medication and sweating it out. "Don't you want to leave?" I handed her a glass of water. Amy shook her head. "I can't bear to. It's meaningless. These kids aren't your responsibility." 2 years ago, Amy volunteered to teach, never expecting to be entangled in this snow-capped grassland. Only through education could they have a chance to explore the world beyond the grassland. Amy looked at the bubbling wall and said, "I think it's meaningful." At that moment, I thought Amy had not suffered enough. Too much hardship would eventually lead to giving up. People always prioritize themselves. Half a month later, an earthquake struck. Amy stayed behind to rescue the trapped students and never returned. I watched the children crying in a heap. I joined in the post-disaster relief efforts. I was exhausted, experiencing hallucinations, and seeing Edward. He stood there quietly, not too close, not too far. But it was just a moment, and he disappeared. Instead of leaving, I took over for Amy. The children still called me Amy. The post-disaster reconstruction work was done well. An anonymous donor funded the rebuilding of the school. A place worthy to be called a school. I buried my mother's ashes beneath the snow-capped mountains. I believe she would have liked it there. And I stayed there for many years. Later, someone said, "Why bother? These children aren't your responsibility. Only through education will they have the chance to step out of the grassland and see the world beyond." I clutched the flowers in my hand, feeling a sense of purpose. I watched these children grow up slowly. They learned to read and write at school, studying seriously, gaining knowledge and aspirations. They knew there was a vast world beyond the grassland. They wanted to venture out. And I wanted them to. Amy, there's a letter for you. These years, I started to work in social media. I recorded the lives of these children, made videos, and posted them on short video platforms. I often receive letters from people showing concern for these kids. I returned to my room and opened the envelope. A blank sheet of paper, nothing written on it. I opened a drawer where a stack of blank papers lay. I spread out a blank sheet on top and locked it. Our lives must go on.